The first time Florence Pritchard tried to escape Silas Grimshaw's ranch house, she made it as far as the smokehouse before his men dragged her back by the hair, and she swore to herself, teeth gritted against the pain, that she would try again before the sun rose twice more. It was the autumn of 1878, in the dry country west of the Pecos River, where the mesquite grew stubborn and the wind carried the smell of cattle and dust for miles. Florence had lived her whole life on the Pritchard spread, a modest but well-watered stretch of land her father Walter had carved out of the wilderness 15 years before, back when the Comanche still rode through in the spring, and a man's life was worth exactly as much as his rifle and his nerve. Walter Pritchard had died 6 weeks earlier, thrown from a spooked horse, or so the coroner in Fort Stockton had ruled. Florence did not believe it. Her father had ridden horses since before she was born, and the mare that threw him had been gentle as a lamb the week prior. She had her suspicions about who benefited from her father's death, and those suspicions had a name, and that name was Silas Grimshaw. Grimshaw owned the neighboring spread, 12,000 acres of scrubland that bordered the Pritchard property along the only reliable stretch of the creek for 20 miles. He had wanted that water for as long as Florence could remember, and he had made her father 3 offers to buy the land outright, each one lower than the last, as though poverty might soften a man's resolve. Walter Pritchard had refused every time, and 6 weeks after his final refusal, he was dead, and 2 weeks after that, Grimshaw's men had ridden onto the Pritchard land with a paper claiming Florence, as the unmarried daughter and sole heir, was now a ward of the county, and that the county, in its wisdom, had granted her guardian status to the nearest respectable landowner until she could be properly married and settled. It was nonsense, of course. There was no judge in Texas who would have signed such a paper honestly, and Florence suspected the signature at the bottom belonged to a magistrate who owed Grimshaw money or feared him too much to refuse. But nonsense backed by 6 armed men on a woman alone was nonsense with teeth, and so Florence Pritchard had been brought to Grimshaw's ranch house under the polite fiction of guardianship, with the real intention, spoken plainly enough by Grimshaw himself on the second night, of marrying her within the month and folding her father's land into his own through the simplest means the law allowed a man of his position. "You will come to see the sense in it," Grimshaw had told her, sitting across the supper table with his silver watch chain catching the lamplight. He was a broad man, going soft at the middle but still strong through the shoulders, with a face that might have been called handsome 20 years and as many cruelties ago. "A woman alone on the frontier is a woman in danger, Miss Pritchard. I am offering you protection, a home, a name." "You are offering me a cage with better furniture," Florence had said, and for that she had spent the night locked in the back bedroom with the window nailed shut. She was 22 years old, dark-haired and sun-browned from a life spent more often in the saddle than in a parlor, and she had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his land. She did not cry that first night, though she wanted to. She lay awake instead, working the nail loose from the window frame with a hairpin, one patient turn at a time, until near dawn it came free in her palm like a small, cold victory. The escape attempt through the smokehouse came 4 days later, and it failed, and the day after that, word reached the Texas Rangers outpost at Fort Stockton that a young rancher's daughter was being held against her will on the Grimshaw property under a fraudulent guardianship claim. The word came from Mrs. Agatha Doyle, the Pritchard family's longtime housekeeper, a widow of 60 who had raised Florence nearly as much as Walter had, and who had ridden 22 miles alone on a mule to bring the news, because there had been no one else left to send. The ranger who took her statement was a man named Albert Keller. He was 26 years old, lean and sun-weathered in the way of men who spent more nights under open sky than under a roof, with a quiet manner that some mistook for coldness, and a few, the ones who knew him, understood to be the particular stillness of a man who thought carefully before he spoke and meant every word once he did. He had ridden for the Rangers for 4 years, since not long after his own family's homestead in the hill country had been burned out by raiders when he was 22, an event he did not speak of often and never lightly. He had lost his younger sister in that fire, a girl of 17 who had begged him, in the last conversation they ever had, to teach her to shoot so she could protect herself, and whom he had put off, laughing, telling her there would be time enough for that later. There had not been time enough. He had buried her himself, dug the grave with his own hands because he would not let anyone else do it, and he had joined the Rangers 3 months after with a grief in him that had hardened over the years into a particular and unshakable conviction that when a person needed help and he was within riding distance of giving it, he would ride. Mrs. Doyle told him everything she knew, her hands shaking around a cup of coffee she did not drink, and Albert Keller listened without interrupting, the way he listened to everything, and when she finished he stood and reached for his hat. "I will need 2 other men," he said to his captain, a broad, graying man named Ezra Wade who had commanded the Fort Stockton Company for 11 years and had seen enough of West Texas to be surprised by very little. "Grimshaw has friends in Austin," Wade said, not as an argument but as a fact to be weighed. "This will not be a popular arrest." "It will be a lawful one," Albert said. "The paper is a forgery. The girl has been taken against her will. I do not need it to be popular. I need it to be right." Wade studied him a long moment, then nodded, because he had learned over the years that arguing with Albert Keller once he had settled on a matter of right and wrong was like arguing with a river about which way it meant to flow. "Take Danforth and Ruiz," Wade said, "and Albert, come back whole. That girl is not worth your life, however wronged she is." Albert did not answer that, because he did not entirely agree with it, though he understood why a captain who had buried enough Rangers might feel obliged to say it. They rode out within the hour, 3 men and 4 horses across country that had gone brittle and gold with the first edge of autumn, following a trail that Mrs. Doyle had described as best she could, and that Albert filled in with the tracker's instinct he had built over 4 years of finding people who did not always wish to be found. It took them the better part of 2 days to reach the Grimshaw spread, riding wide around the main road to avoid being seen, and by the time they came within sight of the ranch house on the evening of the 2nd day, Albert Keller had already decided, without quite admitting it to himself, that he was more interested in the safety of a woman he had never met than in the legal niceties of arresting Silas Grimshaw for land fraud. He was not entirely wrong to feel that way, though he would have been startled to learn just how little rescuing Florence Pritchard actually wanted or needed from him. Florence, in the 2 days since her failed escape through the smokehouse, had not been idle. She had studied the house the way her father had taught her to study a horse before trying to break it, learning its habits, its weaknesses, the hours when the men grew careless with drink, and the hours when the dogs were fed and thus distracted. She had found, on the 3rd night, that the pantry window at the rear of the kitchen had a latch that had rusted nearly through, and on the 4th night, while Grimshaw entertained 2 of his ranch hands with whiskey in the front room, she had worked that latch free with the same patient hairpin that had failed her at the bedroom window, and slipped out into the dark with nothing but the clothes on her back and a kitchen knife she had palmed from the block. She had gotten as far as the horse corral, had in fact gotten a rope around the neck of a sturdy bay gelding, and was in the act of swinging herself up onto its bare back, when a shout went up from the house, and she heard boots on hard-packed earth and knew, with the particular clarity that comes in moments of danger, that she would not make it to the tree line before they caught her. She was still trying, all the same, whipping the gelding into a run with her heels and a fistful of mane, when 3 horsemen came up out of the dry wash to the north like they had risen out of the ground itself, and one of Grimshaw's men, a broad-shouldered hand named Coyproot, skidded his own horse to a stop so hard it nearly threw him, because the man in front of the 3 strangers had a Winchester already leveled and a voice that carried across the corral like a rifle shot itself. "Texas Rangers," Albert Keller said. "Nobody move unless you want to answer for it in Fort Stockton." There was a long, taut silence, the kind that stretches out over a heartbeat and feels like an hour. And in that silence, Florence Pritchard sat astride a stolen horse in the middle of a corral, breathing hard, her hair come loose from its pins and hanging wild around her face, looking at the three riders with an expression that was not gratitude but something closer to suspicion. Because in her experience, men who arrived suddenly to save a woman generally wanted something from her in return. And she had had quite enough of men wanting things from her. Grimshaw came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves, his face gone dark with fury, and behind him 2 more of his hands came with rifles half raised, and for a moment it looked as though the whole yard might erupt into gunfire. "This is my property," Grimshaw said, "and that girl is my ward under the law, and you have no business here, Ranger." "I have a sworn statement from Agatha Doyle," Albert said, "and a strong suspicion that the paper naming you her guardian will not survive an honest reading by any judge outside your own pocket. Miss Pritchard, are you being held here against your will?" Florence opened her mouth to answer and found to her own surprise that the answer was not simple. Yes, she wanted to say. Yes, obviously, take me from this place. But some old, stubborn part of her, the part that had spent 4 days working locks and latches with her own 2 hands, rebelled at the thought of being handed her freedom by a stranger with a rifle, as though she had not been fighting for it herself all along. "I am leaving," she said instead, lifting her chin, "with or without your help, Ranger. I had this horse halfway to the tree line before you arrived." A ripple of something crossed Albert Keller's face, not quite a smile though close to one, and he kept his rifle steady on Grimshaw all the same. "Then we will call it a fortunate coincidence," he said, "that we happen to be riding the same direction." It was Danforth and Ruiz who kept Grimshaw's men pinned, while Albert walked his horse forward and reached up, not to pull Florence down as though she were a parcel to be handled, but simply to steady the gelding's reins while she swung her leg over and dropped to the ground on her own 2 feet, which she did with a stiff, deliberate pride that told him plainly enough she did not wish to be touched or assisted any more than absolutely necessary. Grimshaw was still shouting about lawyers and judges and the trouble he would bring down on all their heads, and it was only when Albert produced, from inside his coat, the actual writ he had obtained from a circuit judge in Fort Stockton 2 days prior, authorizing the arrest of any man found holding a citizen under a fraudulent guardianship claim, that Grimshaw's bluster faltered into something quieter and more dangerous, a stillness that Florence, who had lived under his roof for 6 days, recognized as far more frightening than his shouting. "This is not finished," Grimshaw said low as Albert's men bound his wrists. "No," Albert agreed. "But it is finished here tonight on this ground. What comes after, we will meet when it comes." They did not arrest all of Grimshaw's men, not that night, for there were only 3 rangers against 6 ranch hands, and the sensible course was not to press for more than the law and their numbers could hold. They took Grimshaw himself, bound and furious, along with the forged guardianship paper as evidence, and they took Florence Pritchard, who insisted on riding her own horse, thank you, and not being led on a rope like a captured Mustang. And the small party rode out from the Grimshaw ranch under a sky gone violet and gold with the last of the sunset, 6 days after Florence had first been taken from her home. It was 2 miles down the trail, once the ranch house had disappeared behind a fold of hills, and the tension had begun, slowly, to drain out of all their shoulders, that Florence finally spoke the words that had been sitting in her chest since the corral. "I never asked to be rescued," she told the ranger, her voice tight, not with ingratitude exactly but with the particular soreness of a woman who has spent a week proving to herself that she did not need saving, only to have it handed to her anyway. "I had that latch worked loose 2 days before you rode in. I had a rope on that horse. I would have made the tree line." Albert Keller rode a moment in silence, his eyes on the darkening trail ahead, and when he answered, his voice held no offense at all, only a kind of plain, unhurried honesty that Florence had not expected from a man carrying a badge and a rifle. "I know," he said. "I did not ride 2 days through that country because I thought you couldn't manage it yourself, Miss Pritchard. I rode because Mrs. Doyle came 22 miles on a mule to tell us what was happening to you, and because I could not sit in Fort Stockton knowing it and do nothing. I asked to be the one who tried. Whether you needed trying or not, that was mine to ask for, not yours to grant me permission over." Florence turned that answer over in her mind for the rest of the ride, saying nothing more, but something in her had shifted, some small resistance loosened, because in all her 22 years she had rarely heard a man speak of helping her as something he had wanted for himself rather than something he expected her to be grateful for. They made camp that night in a shallow arroyo where a spring kept a stand of cottonwoods green even in the dry season, and it was there, over a small fire that Ruiz built low and careful against the dark, that Florence Pritchard and Albert Keller began, without quite meaning to, the long, slow work of coming to know each other. Danforth took the first watch, walking the perimeter with his rifle, and Ruiz saw to the horses, and Grimshaw sat bound and sullen at the far edge of the firelight, and Florence found herself seated across from Albert Keller with a tin cup of coffee warming her hands and nothing much to do but talk or sit in silence, and she discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred talking. "You said Mrs. Doyle rode 22 miles, she said. "On a mule, at her age." "She did not seem inclined to discuss her age when I raised the matter," Albert said, and there was a warmth in it, almost a smile, that softened the plain lines of his face. "She said you had no one else to send for, and she was not about to let a good woman's daughter be married off by force while she sat home wringing her hands." Florence felt something catch in her throat, unexpected, and she looked down at her coffee to hide it. "She has been with us since before my mother died. I was 9. She is more family to me than half the blood relations I have left in this world." "Then you are fortunate," Albert said, "to have someone who would ride that far for you." "And you," Florence said, looking up at him now, curious despite herself. What made a man ride 2 days through Grimshaw's country for a woman he had never met? Captain Wade cannot have ordered it lightly, not against a man with friends in Austin. Albert was quiet a moment, turning his own cup in his hands, and the fire popped and sent up a small shower of sparks that died before they reached the branches overhead. "I had a sister," he said finally, "younger than me, 17 when I lost her. Raiders burned our place in the hill country, and I was 2 days' ride away hunting strays when it happened, and by the time I got home there was nothing left to do but bury her. She had asked me, not 2 weeks before, to teach her to shoot, so she could look after herself if trouble came while I was away. I told her there would be time enough for that later." He looked into the fire, not at Florence, and his voice, when he continued, had gone very quiet. "There was not time enough. I have spent 4 years since making sure that when I hear of trouble I am close enough to reach and able enough to help. I do not tell myself there will be time enough later. I ride." Florence sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into her chest alongside her own grief, her own father dead 6 weeks and buried in ground he had cleared with his own 2 hands. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it fully, "for your sister." "And I am sorry for your father," Albert said. "Mrs. Doyle told me what happened. The thrown horse." "It was not a thrown horse," Florence said, sharper than she meant to, though Albert did not flinch from it. "My father rode that mare 100 times. She was gentle as a kitten. I do not know how Grimshaw arranged it, but I know in my bones that he did, and I mean to prove it once I have my land back and my name clear of his lies." "Then we want the same thing," Albert said, "though perhaps for different reasons. I want Grimshaw answering for the forged paper and for holding you against your will. If there is more beneath that, a murder dressed up as an accident, I will help you find the proof of it, if proof is there to be found." It was the word "we," quiet and unremarkable as Albert said it, that struck Florence most, because it was the first time in 6 weeks that anyone had spoken to her not as a woman to be managed or protected or married off, but as a partner in a fight that concerned them both. They rode 2 more days to reach Fort Stockton, and in those 2 days the careful distance between them wore away by degrees, the way a trail wears smooth under enough traveling. Florence learned that Albert Keller had grown up the eldest of 4, that he had wanted, once before the fire, to be nothing more than a rancher like his father, that he still kept his sister's hair ribbon folded in his saddlebag, though he could not have said why except that it felt wrong to leave it behind. Albert learned that Florence had taught herself to read from her mother's Bible and a stack of newspapers her father brought back from town, that she could rope a calf better than most of the hands her father had ever hired, that she had turned down 2 marriage proposals in the last 3 years because neither man had asked her a single question about what she wanted from her own life, only told her what they intended to give her. "And what do you want?" Albert asked her on the second night as they sat apart from the others near a fire gone down to embers. "From your own life, Miss Pritchard. Once Grimshaw is dealt with, once the land is secure, what is it you are riding toward?" Florence considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because no one in her memory had ever asked it so plainly. "I want to keep my father's land," she said. "I want to raise good cattle on good water and not have to marry a man to hold on to either. I want someday, if I am fortunate, to love someone who does not see my land or my inheritance first and myself second. I do not know if such a man exists in this territory." "He might," Albert said, quiet, "if you gave him the chance to prove it." Florence looked at him across the dying fire, and something passed between them that neither named aloud that night, though both felt the shape of it settling into the space between their 2 silences. They reached Fort Stockton on the 3rd day, and Grimshaw was placed in the county jail to await a circuit judge's ruling on the forged guardianship paper, and Florence gave her own sworn statement to Captain Ezra Wade, a statement so clear and so damning, delivered in a voice that did not waver even once, that Wade remarked afterward to Albert that he had rarely seen a witness testify with such composure, man or woman. "She is not a woman who composes herself for anyone's comfort but her own," Albert said, and there was something in the way he said it, some private pride, that made Wade look at him a moment longer than the comment strictly required. But Fort Stockton was not the end of the trouble, and both Florence and Albert knew it. Grimshaw's lawyer arrived within 2 days, a slick, quick-tongued man from Austin named Whitcomb, who argued that the guardianship paper, whatever its irregularities, had been executed in good faith, and that the real crime here was a ranger overstepping his authority to interfere in a private family matter. It was a thin argument, and the circuit judge, a weathered man named Judge Corliss who had seen his share of land disputes dressed up as legal niceties, was inclined to dismiss it outright, but Whitcomb managed, through some combination of legal maneuvering and the money that men like Grimshaw always seemed to have on hand, to secure a delay of 2 weeks before the matter would be formally heard. And in that delay, Grimshaw was released on a bond that Florence considered an outrage and Albert considered, grimly, an opportunity for exactly the kind of trouble he had hoped to prevent. "He will not simply wait for the judge's ruling," Albert told Florence, the afternoon Grimshaw walked out of the county jail a free man, his lawyer at his elbow and a look on his face that Florence recognized from 6 days spent under his roof, a look that said this matter was far from settled in his own mind. "A man like that does not lose gracefully. You should not return to your ranch alone." "It is my land," Florence said. "I will not abandon it to sit safely in town while Grimshaw decides whether to burn it down out of spite." "I did not say abandon it," Albert said. "I said not alone." And so it was decided, with Captain Wade's grudging approval, and a small stipend authorized for the protection of a witness whose testimony would be needed at the coming hearing, that Albert Keller would ride with Florence Pritchard back to her father's land, and remain there, along with Mrs. Doyle and whatever hands could be trusted, until the matter of Sela's Grimshaw was settled once and for all. The ride back to the Pritchard ranch took a day and a half, and it was different from the ride to Fort Stockton in ways neither of them spoke of directly, but both felt keenly. There was no urgency of rescue now, no Grimshaw riding behind them, only open country and long silences that had stopped feeling uncomfortable somewhere around the second night at the Arroyo, and had begun, instead, to feel like a kind of company neither wanted to end. They talked of small things, the shape of clouds building over the western mountains, the particular stubbornness of the mule Mrs. Doyle had ridden, the way the light changed on the Caliche Flats in late afternoon until the whole world seemed dipped in copper. And they talked, too, of larger things, carefully, the way people do when they are testing whether a subject can bear the weight of honesty. "Are you frightened?" Albert asked her on the last night before they reached the ranch, "of what waits for you there? Grimshaw's men have been on that land for a week. There is no telling what state you will find it in." Florence considered the question honestly, as she had come to understand was the only way Albert Keller ever asked anything. "I am frightened," she admitted. "But I have been frightened before, and I have not let it stop me from doing what needs doing. My father used to say that fear is not the opposite of courage, it is the raw material of it. A man who feels nothing is not brave, he is simply careless. It is the man who feels the fear and rides anyway who has earned the word. Your father sounds as though he was a wise man." "He was a hard man in his way," Florence said, "but a fair one, and he loved this land more than he ever managed to say in words, though he showed it every day in the way he worked it. I mean to keep it whole for his memory, whatever it costs me." "It will not cost you your life," Albert said, quiet but firm, "not while I am riding beside you." Florence looked over at him in the dying light, and for the first time since the corral at Grimshaw's ranch, she let herself feel, fully and without argument, the particular warmth of being cared for by someone who did not seem to expect anything from her in return except the chance to keep trying. "Thank you," she said, and this time there was no sharpness in it at all. They reached the Pritchard ranch the following afternoon and found it, to Florence's relief, largely undisturbed. Grimshaw's men had not lingered there once their guardianship scheme had gone wrong. They had returned instead to their own spread to await their employer's next move. And so the house stood as Florence remembered it, low and whitewashed with a wide porch her father had built the summer she turned 12. The barn beside it weathered gray, the corrals empty, but for a handful of cattle that had wandered close for the water. Mrs. Agatha Doyle was waiting on the porch when they rode in, having returned herself 2 days prior, once she learned from a passing rider that Florence had been recovered. And the sight of her, small and gray-haired and fierce as ever, standing with her hands on her hips in the doorway of the house Florence had grown up in, undid something in Florence that 6 days of captivity and 2 days of hard riding had not managed to undo. She slid from her horse and crossed the yard at something close to a run, and Mrs. Doyle caught her in arms stronger than they looked, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, only held on. "You foolish, brave girl," Mrs. Doyle said finally into Florence's hair, "riding off on some fool's horse in the dark. You could have broken your neck before the ranger ever arrived." "I nearly did," Florence admitted, laughing despite the tears standing in her eyes. "But I would have tried it again and again until it worked, and you know it." "I know it," Mrs. Doyle said, pulling back to look at her properly, checking her over the way she had checked Florence for scrapes and bruises since she was a child of 9. Then her sharp eyes moved past Florence's shoulder to where Albert Keller sat his horse, waiting with the particular patience of a man who understood this reunion was not his to interrupt. "And you, Mrs. Doyle said, are the ranger who rode her home." "Albert Keller, ma'am," Albert said, touching his hat. "You have my thanks for riding as far as you did to bring word of Miss Pritchard's trouble. Not many would have made that ride alone." "Not many needed to," Mrs. Doyle said, "because not many loved her the way I do." She studied him a moment longer, something calculating and not unkind in her expression, the look of a woman who had spent decades reading the character of men who came calling around a household with a young woman in it. "You will stay, then, until this business with Grimshaw is finished." "If Miss Pritchard will have me," Albert said, "and Captain Wade's authority permits it, yes." "He will have you," Mrs. Doyle said, before Florence could answer for herself, and there was a glint in her eye that made Florence flush and look away, because she suspected, not for the first time, that Mrs. Doyle understood things about her own heart before she had fully admitted them to herself. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was, in its way, the happiest Florence had known since before her father's death. Albert took a room in the small bunkhouse at the edge of the yard, and busied himself in the mornings with the practical work of a ranch that had gone 6 weeks without a strong hand to manage it, mending fence and checking on the scattered cattle, and riding the property line to be sure no more of Grimshaw's men had drifted onto Pritchard ground uninvited. Florence worked alongside him more often than not, because she had never been the kind of woman to sit idle in a parlor while there was fence to mend, and it was in these ordinary hours, side by side with hammer and wire and the wide Texas sky overhead, that the two of them came to know each other in the way that matters most, not through grand declarations, but through the small, accumulating evidence of character. The patience Albert showed with a stubborn calf that would not be roped, the quiet joke Florence made that startled a real laugh out of him, the way he handed her the heavier end of a fence post without being asked and without making a show of it, the way she noticed and thanked him for it anyway. One evening, perhaps 10 days into his stay, they sat together on the porch steps after supper, Mrs. Doyle having retired early with the excuse of a headache that Florence privately suspected was diplomatic rather than genuine, and the stars came out over the flat country in numbers that always startled visitors from the east and never failed to comfort Florence, who had grown up beneath them. "You have not asked me," Albert said after a long companionable silence, "why I have not married before now. Most men my age have a wife and a child or two by this point." "I assumed," Florence said carefully, "that it had something to do with your sister." "A man carrying that kind of grief does not always have room left for courting." "That is part of it," Albert admitted. "But there is more. I have met women, in the towns I have passed through, who wanted a ranger's badge more than they wanted the man wearing it, or who wanted a husband who would give up riding and settle safely behind a store counter, which I understood, and could not blame them for wanting, but could not give them either. I did not think I would find a woman who wanted both the man and the life he actually lived, until I rode into a corral outside Grimshaw's ranch and found one halfway to the tree line on a horse she had no business stealing, arguing with me about whether she needed rescuing at all." Florence laughed, a real laugh that carried out into the dark yard, and it was a good sound, warm and unguarded. "I was very rude to you that first night." "You were honest," Albert said. "There is a difference, and I have come to prefer honesty to politeness in every woman I have ever known, though I have not known many who offered it so plainly." "And what," Florence asked, turning to look at him directly now, her heart beating faster than the question alone should have warranted, "do you want, Albert Keller, from your own life, once Grimshaw is settled and I no longer need protecting?" Albert was quiet a moment, and when he answered, his voice had none of its usual careful reserve, only a kind of open honesty that made Florence's breath catch in her chest. "I want," he said, "to keep riding toward you, Florence Pritchard, for as long as you will let me. Not because you need saving. I have understood since that first night in the corral that you do not need saving by me or by any man. I want to ride toward you because when I am near you I feel less like a man carrying an old grief and more like a man building toward something worth having. I do not know what you call that exactly, but I know I have not felt it before, not with such certainty, not with anyone." Florence sat with that for a long moment, the stars wheeling slow overhead, the night wind carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the trembling she felt in her own chest. "I call it the same thing you do," she said. "I did not think I would find a man who wanted to stand beside me rather than in front of me, blocking my view of my own life. I find that I am glad to have been wrong about that." Albert reached over, slow and careful, and took her hand where it rested on the porch step between them, and Florence did not pull away, and for a long while they sat like that, saying nothing further because nothing further needed saying. But the peace of those weeks was not destined to last uninterrupted, for Silas Grimshaw had not spent his 2-week reprieve sitting idle either. Word reached the ranch, carried by a hand named Tomas who worked a spread further down the creek and had no particular loyalty to Grimshaw, that the man had been buying whiskey and rifles in equal measure, and speaking loudly in the saloon at the crossroads about a rancher's daughter and a meddling ranger who had made him a fool in front of half the county, and about how a man ought not to let such insults stand unanswered, judge or no judge, hearing or no hearing. "He means to come here," Albert said. Once Tomas had ridden on and Florence had relayed the message, standing in the yard with the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the packed earth. "Before the hearing, while he still has the numbers and the nerve. A man like Grimshaw does not wait to lose in a courtroom what he thinks he can win with a gun." "Then we will be ready for him," Florence said, and there was no fear in her voice now, only a hard, clear resolve that Albert had come to recognize as entirely her own, not borrowed from him or from anyone. They spent the following 2 days in careful preparation, not with the frantic energy of panic, but with the steady, methodical work of people who understood exactly what was coming and meant to meet it well prepared. Albert rode to Fort Stockton and back in a single exhausting day to request additional support from Captain Wade, who authorized 2 more rangers, Danforth and a young man named Hollis, to ride out and reinforce the Pritchard ranch until the matter was resolved. Florence, meanwhile, organized the household with the same calm efficiency she brought to every task, moving Mrs. Doyle's most precious belongings to the root cellar for safety, checking every rifle in the house for readiness, and riding the property line herself to identify the best vantage points should Grimshaw's men come at them from the creek side or the road. "You do not have to fight alongside us," Albert told her, the night before they expected trouble, watching her clean her father's old Winchester with the same careful attention she gave to everything. "You could take Mrs. Doyle and ride to Fort Stockton, wait it out there in safety." Florence looked up at him, and there was no anger in her expression, only a patient certainty that had by now become familiar to him. "This is my father's land," she said. "My mother is buried under that cottonwood by the creek, and my father beside her these 6 weeks past. I have run from this house once already, dragged off it against my will, and I will not run from it again, not while I have breath and a rifle and a reason worth fighting for. If Grimshaw comes, he will find me standing on my own porch, not hiding 20 miles away hoping other people settle my troubles for me." "I did not think you would answer any other way," Albert said, and there was pride in his voice, plain and unhidden. "I only wanted to be sure the choice was yours, freely made, and not something I had talked you into." "It is entirely mine," Florence said, "and I am glad, Albert Keller, that you are the kind of man who thought to ask." Grimshaw came 2 nights later, under a moon just past full, riding at the head of 8 men, more than Albert had hoped for and fewer than he had feared, and the fight that followed was sharp and frightening but, by the mercy of careful preparation, mercifully brief. Albert and Danforth held the front approach from the barn's shadow, and Hollis covered the creek side where Florence had guessed correctly that some of Grimshaw's men would try to slip in unseen, and Florence herself, positioned at an upstairs window with her father's Winchester steady in her hands, put a bullet through the hat of a man named Coy Prout before he could climb the fence into the yard, a shot close enough to send him scrambling backward into the dark shouting that the girl herself was shooting at them, which did more to break the nerve of Grimshaw's hired men than any amount of Ranger gunfire, because men paid to intimidate a lone woman had not signed on to be shot at by one. who knew how to aim. It was Grimshaw himself who pressed hardest, riding almost to the porch steps before Albert stepped out from the barn's shadow and put himself between the house and the charging horse, rifle raised, and shouted for Grimshaw to stand down or be shot from his saddle. And in the chaos of that moment, with dust and moonlight and the shouts of frightened men filling the yard, Grimshaw wheeled his horse and fired wild, and the shot caught Albert high in the shoulder, spinning him half around before he dropped to one knee in the dirt. Florence saw it from the upstairs window, saw Albert fall, and later she would not be able to say clearly how she got from that window to the yard below. Only that one moment she was watching in horror, and the next she was outside in the cold night air, her father's Winchester still in her hands, standing over Albert Keller with a fury that burned through every trace of fear she might otherwise have felt. "Get off my land," she said to Grimshaw, and her voice carried across the yard with a clarity that stopped even his own men in their tracks, "or I will finish what my ranger started, and I promise you, Silas Grimshaw, I do not miss." Grimshaw looked at her, astride his horse in the moonlight, blood already staining the dirt where Albert knelt, and something in her face, some absolute and unwavering certainty, seemed finally to break through even his considerable arrogance, because he understood in that moment that the girl he had once thought to marry off for her land was entirely capable of doing exactly what she promised. It was Hollis, coming up from the creek side with his own rifle raised and two of Grimshaw's men already disarmed behind him, who tipped the balance fully, and within another minute the fight was over, Grimshaw's remaining men throwing down their weapons rather than face a fight they had already lost, and Grimshaw himself, seeing his numbers broken and his own arm grazed by a shot from Danforth, finally wheeling his horse and fleeing into the dark alone, abandoning the men who had ridden with him. He did not get far. Word of the attack reached Fort Stockton within the day, carried by Hollis riding hard, and Captain Wade himself led a party out that found Grimshaw 2 days later, holed up at a line shack 20 miles south, and brought him back in irons to face not only the forged guardianship charge, but now the far more serious charge of attempted murder of a Texas Ranger, and armed assault on a private residence. The circuit judge, when the hearing finally came, did not take long to reach his ruling, and Silas Grimshaw was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary at Huntsville, a sentence that effectively ended, once and for all, any claim he might have pressed on the Pritchard land or on Florence Pritchard herself. But that resolution came later, and in the immediate aftermath of the attack, Florence had eyes for nothing but Albert Keller, bleeding in the dirt of her father's yard. She got him inside with Mrs. Doyle's help, the two of them half carrying him up the porch steps he had built with his own hands only days before, and laid him on the kitchen table where Mrs. Doyle had years ago tended every scraped knee and fevered brow in the Pritchard household, and Florence cut away his shirt with steady hands despite the way her heart pounded, and found the wound high in his left shoulder, ugly but by some mercy, missing the artery that would have made it fatal. "You are not allowed to die," she told him, fierce and low, as she packed the wound with clean cloth the way her father had taught her, years ago, tending an injured hand during a roundup. "Do you hear me, Albert Keller? I have only just decided I want you in my life, and I will not have you leaving it again so soon after arriving." Albert, pale and sweating but conscious, managed something close to a smile despite the pain. "I do not intend to die," he said. "I have too much left to ask you." "Ask me now then," Florence said, "so I have something to hold on to while I finish this bandage and you stop bleeding all over my mother's good table linens." "That is not how a man is meant to propose," Albert said, wincing as she tightened the wrap, bleeding on a kitchen table with his shirt cut open. "I do not much care how it is meant to happen," Florence said. "I care that it happens and that you live long enough to see it through." Albert reached up with his good hand, catching her wrist, stilling her frantic work for just a moment, and looked at her with an expression that held, despite the pain and the blood and the chaos of the night behind them, something entirely steady and sure. "Florence Pritchard," he said, I do not have a ring, and I am bleeding on your mother's linens, which is a poor excuse for a courtship, I will grant you. But I have never in 4 years of riding wanted anything as much as I want to keep riding beside you, for the rest of whatever years we are given. Will you marry me, once I have stopped bleeding and can kneel properly to ask it?" Florence, tears finally slipping free after a night of holding them at bay through sheer will, laughed and cried at once, a sound that was half relief and half joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Albert Keller, though I reserve the right to remind you for the rest of our lives that you proposed while bleeding on my mother's tablecloth." "I would expect nothing less," Albert said, and let his eyes close, exhausted but smiling, while Florence finished the bandage with hands that shook now only from feeling, not from fear. He healed slowly over the following weeks, the wound stubborn but not dangerous, and Florence tended him herself in the front room of the house, refusing every suggestion from Mrs. Doyle that he might be more comfortable convalescing at the fort, because she had discovered, in the long nights of that fight and its aftermath, that she did not wish to be more than a room away from him for longer than necessary. The hearing came and went, Grimshaw's sentence handed down to general satisfaction in the county, and the forged guardianship paper entered into the record as evidence of exactly the kind of fraud it had always been. And with Grimshaw's downfall came, too, a quiet reckoning of the older suspicion Florence had carried since her father's death. A ranch hand who had once worked for Grimshaw, seeking to lighten his own conscience or perhaps simply his own legal troubles, came forward during the investigation to testify that he had heard Grimshaw boasting, in a moment of drunken carelessness, about how easily a gentle mare could be made to spook with the right needle placed just so beneath the saddle blanket. And though the man could not swear directly to Walter Pritchard's death, the testimony was enough, combined with everything else, to satisfy Judge Corliss that justice, however delayed, had finally caught up with Silas Grimshaw for more than one crime. Florence wept when she heard it, not from surprise but from a grief finally allowed to settle rather than fester, and Albert held her through it, saying nothing beyond his presence because he understood better than most that some griefs needed only witness, not words. Winter came on hard that year, the first true cold settling over the Pecos country in November, and Albert Keller, his shoulder healed enough for light work though it would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life, made a decision that surprised Captain Wade only a little. "I mean to resign my commission," Albert told him, standing in the small office at the Fort Stockton outpost with his hat in his hands. "Not because I have lost my taste for the work, or because I doubt the good it does. But I have found something worth staying for, Captain, and I do not think I can give both the Ranger's life and Florence Pritchard's ranch the attention they each deserve. I mean to marry her, and settle on her father's land and raise cattle, and be the kind of husband who is home more nights than he is away." Wade studied him a long moment, the way he had studied him 4 years earlier when Albert had first ridden up asking to join the Rangers, grief-stricken and hard-eyed, and looking for some purpose to pour himself into. "I will miss having you ride for me," Wade said finally. "You were the best tracker I had, and the steadiest hand in a fight I have known in 20 years of this work, but I will not pretend I am surprised, or that I think it the wrong choice. A man can serve justice in more than one uniform, Albert. Sometimes the best service a man can offer is simply being present for the people who need him closest." They shook hands, and Wade told him gruffly that he would always have a place at the outpost if he ever changed his mind, and Albert rode back to the Pritchard ranch that evening feeling lighter than he had in 4 years, as though he had finally set down a weight he had not fully realized he was carrying. Florence was waiting for him on the porch when he rode in, the same porch where they had first spoken openly of what they wanted from their own lives, and when he told her what he had decided, she came down the steps and into his arms without a word, and he held her there in the cold evening air, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimney and the first stars coming out over the flat country, and neither of them needed to say anything more. because everything that mattered had already been decided between them, in 100 small moments across the past 2 months, long before either had spoken it aloud. They married in December in the small church at Fort Stockton, with Mrs. Agatha Doyle standing as the nearest thing Florence had to family and weeping openly through the entire ceremony, and Captain Wade standing as Albert's witness, gruff and proud in his best coat, and half the county turning out because word of the Grimshaw affair had traveled far and wide, and everyone, it seemed, wanted to see for themselves the ranger who had ridden 2 days through dangerous country for a woman he had never met, and the woman who had told him plainly, in a corral in the moonlight, that she had never asked to be rescued. The preacher, an elderly circuit minister named Reverend Hobbs, who had married half the county over the past 2 decades, spoke a few words about partnership and courage that Florence would remember for the rest of her life, though the words that stayed with her most, the ones she would repeat to her own children someday, were the ones Albert had spoken to her that first night on the trail from Grimshaw's ranch, when she had told him she never asked to be rescued, and he had answered simply that he knew, and that he had asked instead to be the one who tried. They settled into the Pritchard ranch house together, and Florence kept her father's name on the deed, and Albert never once suggested otherwise, understanding that the land was hers by right and by love both, earned through her father's labor and her own fierce defense of it. And together they built the herd back up over the following years, buying good stock with the money Albert had saved from his ranger's pay, and the money Florence had carefully guarded from her father's estate. And the ranch prospered in a way it had not since before Walter Pritchard's death, because it was tended now by 2 people who understood, each in their own way, what it meant to fight for something worth keeping. Mrs. Doyle stayed on with them, refusing every gentle suggestion that she might wish to retire to town, declaring that she had raised one Pritchard woman from a girl and intended to see whatever came next through to the end as well. And she got her wish, because within 2 years Florence was carrying their first child, and Mrs. Doyle fussed over her with the same fierce devotion she had shown since Florence was 9 years old, and when the child came, in the autumn of 1880, it was a son, whom they named Walter after Florence's father, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's dark hair, and from the very first, a stubborn set to his jaw that made Albert laugh and declare the boy already halfway to being as difficult as his mother, a comment that earned him a well-aimed pillow across the room and a kiss immediately after to soften the blow. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Agatha, after the woman who had ridden 22 miles on a mule to save a life she had no obligation to save beyond love itself, and Mrs. Doyle wept for an entire afternoon upon hearing the name chosen, declaring it the greatest honor of her long life, and held the infant girl with a tenderness that made even Albert's steady composure waver. The ranch grew, over the years, into one of the most respected spreads in that stretch of the Pecos country, known not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the fairness of its dealings, a reputation that Florence and Albert both guarded carefully, remembering always what it had cost to reclaim the land from a man who valued profit over people. They hired hands who needed steady work and paid them honestly, and when drought came, as it inevitably did in that dry country, they shared what water they had with neighbors less fortunate rather than hoarding it the way Grimshaw once had. And slowly, over years, the Keller name, for Florence took it alongside her own in the way of the time, though she never let the Pritchard name disappear from the deed or from her children's understanding of where they came from, became synonymous in that county not with fear, but with the particular respect earned by people who had survived hardship and chosen, afterward, to be generous rather than hardened by it. Albert never fully lost the ache in his shoulder when the weather turned cold, a permanent reminder of the night Grimshaw's bullet had found him, but he never once, in all the years that followed, spoke of it with regret. He would tell his children, when they were old enough to ask about the faded scar, that it was the finest wound a man could ever earn, because it had been given in defense of the woman who became their mother, and that some costs were worth paying twice over for what they purchased in return. Florence, for her part, never fully lost the fierce independence that had first drawn Albert's attention in that moonlit corral, and she never wanted to, understanding that it was not something Albert had ever asked her to set aside, only something he had asked to stand beside, riding not in front of her nor behind her, but alongside her, exactly as he had promised on that porch step years before. She taught her own daughter to ride and rope and shoot as soon as the girl was old enough to hold a rifle properly, remembering her own father's lessons, and determined that no child of hers would ever again face danger unprepared, the way she herself, briefly, once had. They spoke sometimes in the quiet hours after the children were asleep, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime stillness, of that first night in the corral, and Florence would tease him still, gently, about riding in with his rifle raised as though she had been simply waiting to be saved. "I had that horse halfway to the tree line," she reminded him once, years later, sitting together on the same porch where he had first proposed, with his shirt cut open and blood on his shoulder, their 2 children long since put to bed, and the stars coming out thick and bright overhead. "You did not need to come at all." "I know," Albert said, and reached for her hand the way he had that first night he told her the truth of why he had ridden. "I never came because you needed it, Florence. I came because I needed to be the kind of man who tried, and you happen to be the reason I finally understood what that meant. I would ride that same trail 100 times over, corral and all, just to reach this porch, and this life, and you." Florence leaned into him then, the ache of old griefs long since settled into something more like gratitude, the land beneath them secure and thriving, the man beside her steady and true, and she understood, fully and completely, that she had been right all those years ago to insist she never asked to be rescued, because what she had found instead, what had grown between them across dust and danger and 100 small, honest conversations, was something far better than rescue. It was partnership, freely chosen, by 2 people who had each, in their own way, decided that trying was worth everything it cost, and that love, real love, was not a matter of one person saving another, but of 2 people choosing, again and again, across every hard season the frontier could offer, to ride the same trail together toward whatever came next. And so they did, for the rest of their long and well-lived lives, through droughts and good years both, through the slow growth of their children into strong and capable adults, who inherited both their mother's stubborn courage and their father's quiet steadiness, through everything that West Texas, in all its harsh beauty, ever asked of them. Florence Pritchard Keller died an old woman, decades later, in the same house her father had built and she had fought to keep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing the story of the ranger who rode into a moonlit corral, and the woman who told him plainly she had never asked for saving. And Albert Keller, gray and stooped but still steady, held her hand through her final hours the way he had held it that very first night on the trail, and told her, one last time, the same words he had spoken so long ago. "I know you never asked," he whispered, "but I am glad every single day of my life that I asked to be the one who tried." And Florence, with what strength remained to her, smiled and told him that of all the things he had ever given her, that had always, from the very beginning, been the truest gift of all,